Welcome to Financial Repression Authority's Roundtable Insight, where the best fund managers, economists, and industry leaders discuss the key investment issues and challenges in the current macroeconomic environment.
Hi, welcome to FRA's Roundtable Insight. This is Richard Bernoulli. Today we have Charles Hugh Smith. He's author, leading global finance blogger, and America's philosopher, we call him. He's the author of many books on our economy and society, including A Radically Beneficial World, Automation, Technology, and Creating Jobs for All, Resistance, Revolution, Liberation, a Model for Positive Change, and The Nearly Free University and the Emerging Economy. Also, Pathfinding Our Destiny, Preventing the Final Fall of Our Democratic Republic, and most recently, Will You Be Richer or Poorer? His blog of twominds.com is one of CNBC's top alternative finance sites. Welcome, Charles.
Thank you, Richard. It's a pleasure, and I'm looking forward to our topics of the day.
Yeah, very interesting. A lot happening out there, and I thought we'd begin with a discussion first on providing some context in terms of what's happening with COVID and how it relates to the unfolding of four long-term cycles that you've written about, and then maybe we discuss some challenges resulting from that, and then what happens. Like, what does it look like? What does the new normal look like? What does life in that new normal look like in terms of all of the areas of life, education, restaurants, work, living arrangements, all of that. So if you wanted to start by giving us some context, that would be great.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. And I think before we started recording, you used the word catalyst, and I think that's really what a lot of people are looking at the pandemic as a catalyst. In other words, it's not really the cause of these transformative forces. It's simply the trigger that sort of kicked these longer-term trends and forces into a new dynamic. And so the four forces that I was talking about recently would be these long cycles. And a lot of authors have written about cycles. And a lot of people have questioned whether a cycle is really a real phenomenon, or if it's just us applying like an intellectual structure sort of after the fact. But, I think history is pretty conclusive in a lot of ways that things do run in cycles. And, of course, it makes sense because human nature is still, running wetware 1.0, right? Mm-hmm. And so, human nature runs in cycles. And so why not history? So the four are the debt cycle, which a lot of people call Kondratiev because of the Russian economist who first spoke about debt being a cyclical thing where debt piles up, debt expands, and then there's a breaking point, and then the debt goes into a default phase, and it's all the bad debt has to be cleared out of the system, and then it restarts from a solid base, right? So I think it's pretty clear. A lot of people talk about the debt super cycle, and depending on which length of time you want to look at that, it's really clear that debt is accelerating at an unsustainable pace globally, right? And so there's going to be some reckoning of that debt, either hyperinflation to wipe it out, or a default. Mass default that will wipe it out. One way or the other, it's not going to. It's approaching the end of this particular cycle. Number two is inflation, which runs on longer cycles, and it depends on supply and demand and population growth and this kind of thing. And a lot of people feel that we're approaching the end of the low inflation period that dominated much of the 20th century, and we're going to now enter a highly inflationary period. The third cycle is generational, and that's separate from demographics, which I label separately. generational simply means that there's a theory out there that there's every 4 generations there's an existential crisis in at least U.S. history and perhaps in other countries' histories as well. Another angle on this is developed by historian Peter Turchin, who identifies cycles of roughly 25 years that accumulate into cycles of 50 years and 100 years and so on. And so either of these are really like political social, cycles. And what they how Turchin describes them is there's an integrative phase in society and the economy where there's reasons and incentives to work together. And then that cycle ends, and then it gets to a disintegrative stage where there's fewer reasons or incentives to work together, and society starts breaking apart. And so the fourth one is demographics, meaning the size of the workforce related to the size of the population of children and the population of elderly people who are dependent on the system for pensions and healthcare. And globally, we've seen a birth rate plummet in all continents other than Africa, and this is going to put tremendous pressure on social services that were designed for a completely different world, the post-war world of high population growth, rapid expansion of the workforce, higher wages. All of these conditions made it appear completely feasible to support the elderly population in that generation. But now the elderly population is much larger, the workforce is much smaller, wages are stagnant, and so there's going to be a demographic reckoning as well. So those are the 4 long cycles that I discussed.
Great. And so what happens is when we look at these 4 long-term cycles, those were coming into a confluence altogether at the same time that COVID served as a catalyst for the unfolding of those 4 long-term cycles. And along with that has come some challenges in terms of social distancing, working remotely, less traveling, supply chain disruptions, protectionism overall in the economy, and just overall sufficiency of income to keep it all going. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I would pick up on one of the threads that you mentioned and just speak briefly about the global economy that's developed since the entry of China and other countries to the WTO and the mass expansion of global tourism, global travel, global trade, supply chains. All of this is based on 2 systemic characteristics. One is mobility. In other words, there's been a tremendous rise in the mobility of the human population on the planet. And just statistically, several generations ago in 1960, when jet airliner traffic really started to come into its own, I believe that the number of overseas travelers globally was around 25 million. So about 25 million people traveled internationally in 1960. More recently, the number is, either 1.5 billion or 2 billion. So it's like been an extremely steep increase in the number of people moving around the planet. And of course, this is the ideal setup for a pandemic, right? So mobility is going to be decreased locally, internationally, within national borders, you name it. And so that's going to have enormous impacts on all kinds of industries which have become dependent on mobility. And then the other thing is the global supply chain and economy is very tightly bound as a system, meaning that rather than a bunch of decentralized networks that only connect in a couple of nodes, there's tremendous dependency in the global system on a handful of nodes. And so if any one of those nodes is disrupted, the entire global system is disrupted very quickly. And so we saw this in the 2008 financial crisis, which started in a really small part of the American financial system, which was subprime mortgages, which was no more than $1 trillion total. I believe the number was more like 500 billion, which was a small part of the whole $10 trillion mortgage market and a very small part of the entire, $100 trillion U.S. Financial system. And yet that one little part of the system broke down and blew up, and very quickly it spread into a global crisis. And so we see that in supply chains now. And so what we're going to see is a decoherence, if you will, of all these tightly bound systems. We're going to, it just doesn't work anymore, right? It's too fragile and too vulnerable to disruption. So we're going to have to move to supply chains and movement of capital and movement of people, all of which are more decentralized and localized. So there's not so many connections or nodes that every system is dependent on. So if mobility decreases by, let's say half, well, that's going to mean global tourism decreases by half. And supply chains, price was always the most important thing, right? I call it the tyranny of price. And so for the last several decades, it was all about where can I get the absolutely lowest price, and I don't care about the vulnerability of the supply chain because it always worked, right? And so now we're seeing, well, the supply chain is no longer reliable, or it's extremely vulnerable to disruption. So what's the value in having a supply chain that you control? It's hard to put a price on that, but clearly control of your supply chain is worth a lot. And so there's going to be workarounds and I would say use the term reinvention of the supply chain, and very possibly a bunch of other industries.
Mm-hmm. Before we get into some of those workarounds, just wanted to emphasize the theme that no one size fits all. So whatever the solution or the workaround is just dependent on who you are, where you live, how you're living, what your job is, what your conditions are, and your circumstances just overall. But essentially the conventional way of life we realize now is being inadequate or failing, and it's not going to work. So we need to look for workarounds.
Right. And I would stress that, the conventional kind of pathways, they were one size fits all, in other words, everybody was supposed to go to the office, whether they could have worked at home. Well, no, you were supposed to show up at the office anyway. Right. And there was a lot of, how should we put it, restraints or on choices, because the conventional pathway was considered the best way, the right way, the most efficient, the most profitable, or whatever. And so now that that's breaking down, it actually is going to kind of unleash a lot of creativity. As you say, when one size no longer fits all, well, then the opportunity to come up with 10,000 solutions is now present. There's now room or space that's been opened up for that kind of creativity.
And recently you've written about the potential for opting out of, and that could mean a number of different things. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, Richard, just personally, I've been self-employed for most of my life and run businesses, started businesses, closed businesses. And it takes a huge toll on you as an individual to run an enterprise in today's very complex, a lot of compliance, a lot of regulations, a lot of penalties if you miss a deadline, a lot of fees. And so I think a lot of people running small businesses are burning out. In other words, the stress level of managing the business and keeping the money coming in, it's taken a toll. And so I think a lot of people are looking at this as an opportunity to do what they wanted to, but were hesitant to do, which was kind of close off this part of their life and move on. And for a lot of people, that will mean closing the enterprise that they, poured themselves and poured all their energy into, because it just is no longer viable. and it wasn't maybe not just financially, it was no longer viable, but it was just the emotional burdens were just too great. And so I see it as when we talk about opting out, certainly there's some, for some people, it will mean getting out of the big city and moving full time to their retirement home or their second home somewhere quieter, and maybe retiring early if they can do that. But for other people, it'll be like, well, I'm just kind of done with that part of my life, and I was done with it a year or two ago, but I kind of clung on, and now I'm kind of freed of that, and now I can think about what else I want to do, what else am I enthusiastic about, what other solutions are there, and what else can I do that's going to make my life better, even if I'm making less money.
Mm-hmm. So one solution or workaround would be early retirement. Let's downsize, let's cut costs, live a simpler life. Another would be let's move to a lower cost area. That could be within the same country, or it could mean moving overseas, correct? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, Richard, there was I wrote a few years ago about a model that originated in Japan, but actually I think it's a pretty much a global phenomenon, and it was called half farmer, half X. And what it was describing was, as you know, and probably many of our listeners do, Japan is now losing population, and their population is aging rapidly. So rural Japan has lost a tremendous amount of population, especially in the younger working age populations. And so as a result, housing is extraordinarily cheap in rural Japan. I mean, you can rent a big old farmhouse for like $200 and you're paying, 5 times that for a tiny little room in Tokyo or an urban zone. So there's been this movement of at least a small part of the Japanese youth, but nonetheless a significant movement to go back and to rural Japan where you can live really cheaply and you can actually start growing food or engage in some trade craft, that's appealing, in a lot of ways, and connect with the elderly, craftspeople and farmers in that town or region. And yet you can make money, which you need to survive, by doing remote work. As a designer, as a coder, as marketing, there's just, as we all know, there's thousands of tasks that can be done remotely. And so the idea is move to a much cheaper locale with cultural, social benefits of a slower lifestyle and being able to actually do something that you're not forced to make a ton of money doing, such as you could have a small farm or an orchard or something like that. And then you make money working part-time remotely at much higher wage than you could earn in the rural economy. And so I think, I think we could see this happen in Canada and the U.S., both of which have plenty of land, established farm communities, and a huge concentration currently of high-paying, high-cost lifestyles in big cities. And so you probably saw that note that Facebook is going to cut your wage by 40% if you move out of the San Francisco Bay Area, right? But even so, if you cut your expenses by 2/3, you're still going to be making more money in terms of your purchasing power. Yeah. So that's kind of one model that I think is going to become more attractive.
Mm-hmm. So that's another theme is movement and trend towards localized and decentralized economy.
Right. I think again on the for structurally, systemically, then you want to be able to detach your enterprise from these super fragile, super dependent global nodes, right? You want to be able to connect to one or two nodes, but you have your supply chain under your own control. And so, it's not one size fits all. Like I was going to speak about 3D fabrication, right? So that and also CAD machining, where the software guides the machining tool. There's obviously you cannot make semiconductors in this kind of small setting. There's going to be a lot of things that have to be fabricated in very large facilities, but we can start seeing how these workarounds or reinventing supply chains might start emerging using these new technologies, and which can be distributed over a local economy. But close enough to where an assembly plant or packaging and can be handled within a region. So that's one possibility. And also along the same lines, you've probably read a bunch of articles. I've seen more and more about how small farms that were barely making it, that were hanging on by a thread, 4 months ago, now they're suddenly being recognized as a huge resource, and they're getting a lot of business from the, farm to consumer model, where the farms are taking boxes of vegetables and produce directly to consumers. And that's just allowing them to actually do better than they were when they were delivering just to schools and, restaurants.
Yeah, again, local and decentralized. Another area would be local manufacturing, potentially, right? Given the move towards protectionism, the idea that you've got to make those cell phone parts locally or whatever. Maybe there's the potential to retrofit the malls, shopping malls, which have been dying, or commercial real estate, to local manufacturing, and even to vertical farming, right? Either in the cities and shopping malls or suburbs. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that kind of that would really be reinventing, and yet it's that kind of reinvention is really what we're good at. I think speaking as, say, the developed West, which would include the developed East as well, of course, right? Where we have a highly educated workforce, we have a lot of people willing to try something, an experiment. There's capital willing to go into a risk situation. So there's all the pieces are in place for that kind of model that you're talking about. And as you mentioned manufacturing, and of course, you don't need a gigantic facility in most cases. You can actually fabricate, say, specialty glass, this kind of thing in one building with maybe 60 employees. In other words, a lot of the manufacturing globally is not in gigantic plants with tens of thousands of workers. It's actually relatively small plants. So there is potential for that. In terms of urban farming, I think it's really interesting to talk about vertical farms, especially in cold climates where, you could control the climate and the lighting and grow fresh vegetables year round. And it's something that I like to bring up is these huge urban areas like Paris or London in the early 1900s or late the 1890s, that era when it turns out that about 2/3 of all the food consumed in these giant cities was grown within 10 kilometers of the city center. In other words, there was a very lively urban farming situation. And that's how all these cities, were supplied with food. It did not come hundreds of miles, didn't even come dozens of miles, because the transportation costs were so high that it was very localized. And so you could look at that and go, well, gosh, what would it take to reinvent that model? How could we do that with today's technology? And I think it's obviously, if it was possible in 1910, it's certainly possible now to say we're going to grow 75 to 90% of the food consumed in major metropolitan areas within 10 miles.
Mm-hmm. I can see also in the education sector a move to more local, decentralized structure. You've written a lot about the nearly free university and making use of online resources. That's great. So that's a big trend away from the cartelized educational accreditation type of industry. But what are your thoughts on the younger school kids that would need to be educated online at home, where the parents are also working? What happens there? Do you think that there could be some people in the neighborhood that would be designated or would rise up as offering like home local schooling up to 5 children, perhaps, to keep in compliance with local regulations, of social distancing? Or what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think that model you just sketched is a brilliant one. And again, this idea being that rather than take hundreds or thousands of children and cramming them into one campus, which then creates a security issues, and also viral pandemic kind of risks of, then why not reinvent education into very small groups, which again, there's a long history of education being conducted in small classrooms or rural homes, 10, 12 children maybe, which would be more controllable in terms of concerns about the pandemic, but it would also provide maybe a much better education than what I call the factory model, which was assembling hundreds of children in basically an education factory where they all get stamped with the same curriculum and all that stuff. There's a lot of innovation out in the world that has been successfully fended off by the conventional educational system, right? Because it has a huge entrenched vested interest. And as that breaks down, then it sort of opens up the possibility for much better education. And in terms of higher education, I'm hoping that this is the catalyst to break apart all of higher education, and pursues some of the things similar to my ideas, which I proposed in my book, which was to pursue sort of an apprenticeship model in all fields, not just a trade craft or becoming a chef or something, but coding, marketing, biology. Everything can be done better in the lab or in the workplace and with small groups of people. And you don't even need a campus. You don't need an administration, and you don't need any of that. And so you don't need to spend the $120,000 for the diploma. And I've also, explained why it makes much more sense to accredit each student, not the institution. So if you don't accredit the institution, you only accredit the student, then you don't need the institution. And so you could say the same thing for, the lower educational levels as well. Do we really need this huge compliance structure, these enormous campuses, all the security problems? Maybe if we just radically decentralized education, then we'd lose so much of the cost inefficiency and also the rigidity, the brittleness of the whole thing that didn't allow for innovation.
What are your thoughts on the restaurant industry? Where does that go?
Yeah, that's a really interesting topic. And I, of course, I have no knowledge of the industry other than it's extremely competitive, really tough business financially to survive, right? There's a huge number, and I would say very likely oversupply of restaurants, at least in the US and very likely in the world. So with mobility declining and these guidelines for social distancing and so on, it looks like it's another industry that's going to be massively transformed one way or the other. And I saw some articles out in the mainstream media with some voices saying we should just let it die. And I've read that about movie theaters too. Just let it die. It really wasn't that pleasant. It wasn't that great. Yeah. Let it die. And of course, we're when you talk about the new normal, it's always presumed because of the huge number of vested interest and entrenched interest trying to defend the status quo, it's presumed that the new normal is some mildly different version of the old normal. But in actual fact, it's going to be a new normal where huge sectors of the economy are going to be allowed to die, or they're going to blow up, no matter how many billions are thrown at them to try to save them in terms of saving the old model. So if you look at restaurants, people are talking about, well, maybe there won't be any indoor dining. Maybe it'll be all outdoor. I could see a model where there's only pop-up dining. There is no rigid, fixed expense that people would rent a space for, like, literally a night or a day, and then so their cost structure would drop down. There may be other models out there, but obviously the cost has to drop for the entrepreneurs trying to run restaurants, and also for customers, because I don't know how anybody can afford to eat out anymore, frankly.
Yeah, it's become quite expensive. And could the model go to something like street food vendors in Thailand, for example, that type of model?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent model. And again, if you haven't visited Thailand or Southeast Asia, then you might assume that, this is horribly dirty and dangerous. But actually, I've been to Thailand many times. I know you have too. It's actually a very clean culture, a very clean society, and the food is very clean. I've never known anybody who got sick eating street food. It's always heated, it's always cooked, it's served fresh. And so the idea here in the West, where, well, you need 3 sinks, right? And all this horribly expensive infrastructure in order to legally serve food. If all of that went away, either because people just started ignoring it, or municipalities started realizing that they're going to have to change their regulations to fit the new reality, then we discover that there's plenty of ways to have safe, fun food service that don't require a $10,000 a month, rental space and all the other enormous compliance costs.
I think also there's potential for innovation in local-based recycling and repurposing of whatever, products to be repurposed for another operation or something else.
Yeah, I think you mentioned commercial space. It's like, clearly there's just there's a huge overhang of surplus commercial space in the U.S. Way too much office space and way too much retail. Statistically, I think the numbers are on the order of the U.S. has 5 times more commercial retail space per capita, in other words, per resident, than European countries. So there's going to be an enormous amount of space that's either going to be torn down or repurposed. And there's a lot of potential innovation there, especially if you think about the homeless problem, which is currently being solved by requisitioning motels and hotels. But if there's going to be a huge overhang of millions of square feet of commercial space that no longer have that use, then what else could be done on the cheap? What could be done that would be sort of a workaround to create decent, low-cost living spaces in these basically abandoned buildings?
Mm-hmm. What about the idea on rising property taxes? Could that be a catalyst also in driving out business and a movement towards a more localized, decentralized economy?
Yeah, Richard, before we started recording, you were discussing the differentials in property taxes in Canada between rural, and farm property and urban housing, and I guess that differential is large. And I think just in valuations, the same is true of urban zones in the U.S., where the urban properties are highly valued, so the property taxes are really expensive. And in fact, as you pointed out before we started recording, in many cases it exceeds the household's pension income. So if you retire, you can't even afford to live in your urban house anymore. So and then we start thinking about the decline in mobility, the decline in restaurants and small business retail for all the reasons we discussed, and then you start wondering, well, if so much of the work can be done remotely, why put up with living in these overcrowded, super expensive urban zones? So we could see a mass migration out of these areas, and that would change the price dynamic and very possibly the tax base.
Mm-hmm. What is the future of gyms and exercise?
Wow, that's a tough one. I mean, we've already seen some chains declare bankruptcy, right? It's interesting. I guess part of my answer would be it's interesting to see that bicycle sales have taken off. And I've been an avid bicyclist for decades and put thousands of miles on my cheap mountain bikes, just going around taking care of my normal errands, as well as biking for fun. So, for me, I would be thrilled if cities started really getting serious about safe bikeways and investing in that infrastructure. And so it could be that there's a movement away from gyms and more toward either the home gym, which has always been popular, or possibly, more walking, more biking, and a more walkable, bikeable set of urban or suburban or rural town, urban plans.
Mm-hmm. Could we get cogeneration where people doing exercise could also generate energy and electricity?
Yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of fun ideas out there of stepping on pavement generates a tiny amount of electricity and that kind of thing. It's anything that gets people more fit and improves their diet is obviously going to be key going forward, right? Because at least the American populace, and I think a lot of populations around the world have similar issues where they're really not fit, they're overweight, they have metabolic disorders, their diet could easily be improved. And so maybe we'll see a whole resurgence of health or a focus on what people can do for health, not through some kind of ridiculously expensive health care of pharmaceuticals and $100,000 operations, but workarounds such as we're discussing, more walking, more biking, access to locally grown food, even in cities, and so on. So that could be, I think, a huge cultural transformation, that a reinvention of what we call health, that's not provided by some kind of hospital or pharmaceutical company, but by people's own actions and choices.
Do you see the potential for sort of havens to be identified and come forth in terms of countries or jurisdictions for being able to live somewhat in the old normal society, if you will, for not having social distancing or just wearing no masks, all of those type of things? Do you see that potential maybe with some countries declaring themselves as havens, potentially also for tourism?
Yeah, it's a great topic, Richard, and kind of complicated. And I'll give a couple of ideas. I think that your idea of havens is very interesting because we can see several other versions of havens. Like I think that there could be the potential for havens that have a very creative sort of progressive view of deregulating their rules for enterprise and reuse of buildings, and getting rid of all the obstructions to trying new things. And so I think there's huge potential there for cities, towns, even certainly regions or states, to say we're open for the reinvention of our economy. And so we've gotten rid of a bunch of regulations that were just dead weight, and we welcome capital and labor to come try your ideas here.
Right. Globally, like anybody.
Yeah. Globally, as well as within borders. And then in terms of like a safe haven, here in Hawaii, there's tourism has been completely shut down. I mean, there were 30,000 incoming tourists a day, and then now it's less than 1,000. There's a lot of talk here about redesigning tourism so that it could be safe for the visitors and for the residents. And that's going to require some technology, such as you have to get a test for COVID-19 before you get on a plane. If you test positive, sorry, you're not allowed on the flight to Hawaii. So this kind of constructing safe havens is going to be a huge business opportunity. Anybody that can pull it off and maintain it is going to be obviously a much more attractive destination than with places that don't have any system. Although there will be, as you sort of intimated, there will be a market for like no holds barred, no nothing.
Right.
Just show up, take your chances, good old days.
Yeah. Okay. And finally, how do you see some of the writings that you've done in the past, from blog posts or your books, in happening now through this new normal? It seems like a lot of the concepts and answers, like local, decentralized economy and nearly free university, all of that is coming to happen.
Yeah, actually, I'm pretty excited about finally sort of like the world is catching up to some of my thinking, and many of us have been thinking along the same lines. And now there's actually you can see incentives and a desire to try some new things. And so my web traffic is actually reaching all-time highs in the last few months. So I think that's kind of an indication to me. I haven't really changed anything I'm saying, so I think it must be that people are now interested in alternative ideas and visions.
Exactly. How great. That's unbelievable insight. How can our listeners learn more about your work, Charles?
Yeah, please visit me at oftwominds.com, and there's sample chapters of all my books for free, so you can read more about my ideas for free.
Great. Thank you so much, Charles.
Thank you, Richard.
The FRA Roundtable Insight Show is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered as a solicitation or offer to purchase or sell any securities. The investments, investment strategies, and investment philosophies discussed or presented on the show each involve their own unique risk factors which are not discussed on the show. Any discussions among the panel participants or responses to listener inquiries are based on the personal opinions of the panel participants and do not take into consideration the listener's suitability, objectives, or risk tolerance. Please be advised that you invest or speculate at your own risk.